Howdy and good morning, friends and faithful listeners, and welcome to the Bible Explained podcast on this absolutely lovely Wednesday morning. I hope you all have been having a good start to your week so far. We are in 2nd Chronicles today, and we're going to talk about a few points, actually, that may make you scratch your head when you initially read it. There's a few things in here that I think people have a lot of questions about, specifically the amount of animals that are sacrificed. And also we're going to talk about this little interesting verse where the author of 2nd Chronicles says that the Ark of the Covenant is still in the temple, even though at the time of the writing of 2nd Chronicles, the temple had already been demolished from the Babylonians and the Ark of the Covenant had been gone for about a century at this point. So what's with that verse? We'll talk about all of that today. So we had our first freeze the other night, and before that happened, I had to go outside and get some of my plants because during the summer months, I actually take all of my plants outside because I free up space in my house because I've got way too many plants. So I had this like little, what are those called? Those hope plants? I forget the name of it, the hope thing. It's like a leafy plant that has these weird looking flowers on it. That was outside. And then I had another thing that looks like a hope plant, but it has red flowers instead of white ones. That was outside too. Not to mention all my succulents and herbs. I had to go get all that stuff because we had our first freeze last night. So yeah, I guess winter is starting. But I have a perfect item for you guys. The P40 Ministries beanie. It is available in my shop for those cold, freezing winter days. You're going to want to keep your head nice and warm. And it's actually a really nice hat. I'm not going to lie. I compare it to like the Carhartt hats. It's very similar to that. I don't know if I'm legally allowed to do that, but it feels a lot like the Carhartt hats to me. And it looks really cool too. It is gender neutral, so you should check that out. Link in description. All right, faithful listeners, let's go ahead and read 2nd Chronicles chapter 5. I'll be reading from the WEB version, so grab your cup of coffee or your cup of tea, and also the version of the Bible that you prefer this morning, and let's give reverence to God's word together. Thus all the work that Solomon did for Yahweh's house was finished. Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, even the silver, the gold, and all the vessels, and put them in the treasuries of God's house. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and the heads of the tribes, the princes of the fathers' households of the children of Israel, to Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of Yahweh's covenant out of David's city, which is Zion. So all the men of Israel assembled themselves to the king at the feast, which was in the 7th month. All the elders of Israel came. The Levites took up the ark. They brought up the ark, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The Levitical priests brought these up. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled to him were before the ark, sacrificing sheep and cattle that could not be counted or numbered for multitude. The priests brought in the ark of Yahweh's covenant to its place, into the inner sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place, even under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim covered the ark and its poles above. The poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the ark in front of the inner sanctuary, but they were not seen outside, and it is there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets which Moses put there at Horeb, when Yahweh made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. When the priests had come out of the holy place, for all the priests who were present had sanctified themselves and didn't keep their divisions, also the Levites, who were the singers, all of them, even Asaph, Heman, Jeduthun, and their sons and their brothers, arrayed in fine linen, with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps, stood at the east end of the altar, and with them 120 priests sounding with trumpets. When the trumpeters and singers were as one, to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking Yahweh, and when they lifted up their voice with the trumpets and cymbals and instruments of music, and praised Yahweh, saying, "For he is good, for his loving kindness endures forever," then the house was filled with a cloud, even Yahweh's house, so that the priests could not stand to minister by reason of the cloud, for Yahweh's glory filled God's house. In the last couple episodes, we talked about the building of the temple and how beautiful the temple was supposed to be. But we also talked about some various problems that happened with the building of the temple as well, or problems that could potentially happen in the future. So you should definitely go back and listen to those episodes if you haven't gotten a chance. But now everything is done with the temple, which is why it says in verse 1, thus all the work that Solomon did for Yahweh's house was finished. And now the dedication of the temple begins. Solomon, it says, brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, even the silver, the gold, and all the vessels, and put them in the treasuries of God's house. Back in 1 Chronicles, we talked about how much prep work David did for the temple. David was kind of obsessed with the building of the temple, and he went so far as to acquire all of the building materials for the temple, to lay out the plans for the temple, to purchase where the temple was supposed to be built. So David was pretty obsessed with the building of the temple. And so, of course, before he died, he ended up dedicating a lot of his own personal things to the temple. So to start the dedication process of the temple, it says Solomon brings all the things that David had set aside for the temple, all the gold, all the vessels, all the silver, and he put them in the treasuries of God's house. So we know that the temple itself had these like side rooms. You couldn't get to them from inside the temple itself. They were almost like on the outside of the temple. So you'd have to walk outside to actually get to the storehouses, but they were connected to the temple building. And that was where the priests would keep all of the dedicated things, anything that had meaning to the temple or the money that came in from the people. So what's really funny about this is all of these things that David dedicated just went straight into the storehouses. Like Solomon didn't even use it. And I don't really know why that's the case. Like, I'm not exactly sure why David's stuff just got like thrown into a side room. I don't know, but David put a lot of effort, it sounds like, into some things that Solomon didn't ever really end up doing. In verse 2, it says, then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the princes of the fathers' households of the children of Israel, to Jerusalem to bring up the ark of Yahweh's covenant out of David's city, which is Zion. And that right there begins the most important part of the dedication of the temple, which is bringing the ark into the temple. The ark was considered to be God's throne. It was literally where he sat. That's why the lid of the ark was called the mercy seat. It was because it was God's seat. And of course, God is merciful, so it was a mercy seat. And so obviously, God's house couldn't possibly be finished if God doesn't have his throne in there, which is why the most important aspect of the dedication of the temple was to bring the Ark of the Covenant up into the temple. And so that's what they do. All the men of Israel assembled themselves to the king at the feast, which was in the 7th month. All of the elders of Israel came. The Levites took up the ark. They brought up the ark, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The Levitical priests brought these up. Now, it sounds to me like Solomon actually did something correct that David had not done. Remember back when David first brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, David did not read the Old Testament laws of how the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be handled. And so they just put it on this wagon and like wheeled it through the city. And God was not happy about that because they were directly disobeying a command from the Old Testament, like one of the most basic commands, actually, which was to have the Levitical priests actually carry the ark on their shoulders. And you might be like, well, what's the big deal? Like, what difference does it make if it's on a wagon or if it's being carried by the priests? I'm not going to get back into that today because I covered that in depth on a recent episode not too long ago. So I will link that episode about why it was so important for the Levites to carry the Ark of the Covenant in the description. So you can go over there and listen to that episode once you're done with this one. But Solomon actually followed the Old Testament law here. This is like the one law that he actually followed. In his lifetime, he didn't really follow that many laws, but he did follow this one. He had the Ark of the Covenant carried correctly, as well as the entire tent of meeting. That was the tabernacle that God had told the Israelites to build some 500 years before this in the wilderness. The tent of meeting was essentially the temple for the people, except the tent of meeting was a tent, and it was able to travel around wherever the people went. But now, because there's like a brick and mortar building for the people to go to, The tent of meeting was no longer necessary according to Solomon. And so the tent of meeting was torn down and brought into the temple of God and probably just stored away forever. And we don't know what happened to the tent of meeting. It was probably ultimately destroyed at some point in time, but it ended up never getting used ever again. And that's kind of sad, actually, because the tent of meeting was God's original design for his people, for how worship was supposed to be done. And to see it just get stored away to eventually be destroyed, I don't know, there's something kind of sad about that. But at least Solomon did have it carried correctly. And all the holy vessels also were carried up to the new tabernacle. It says the Levitical priests brought all of these up. And after all of that is done, it says in verse 6 that King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled to him were before the ark, sacrificing sheep and cattle that could not be counted or numbered for multitude. And not gonna lie, I think a lot of people when they read that verse kind of cringe. They're like, oh man, that is a lot of death of animals. The cattle and the sheep sacrifice could not be counted or numbered for multitude. Now, if you go to 1 Kings chapter 8, it talks more about some of these sacrifices that took place during the dedication of the temple. 1 Kings 8, starting in verse 62, says this: the king and all of Israel with him offered sacrifices before Yahweh. Solomon offered for the sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered to Yahweh, 22,000 head of cattle and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated Yahweh's house. So that means that the people, everybody who was at this celebration of the dedication of the temple, the individual people were bringing sacrifices to Yahweh. And Solomon himself had sacrificed approximately 140,000 animals. It turned out that because so many sacrifices of animals were taking place at this time, that the altar in front of the temple was too little. That's what it says here in 1 Kings 8:64. The same day the king made in the middle of the court holy that was before Yahweh's house, for there he offered the burnt offering, the meal offering, and the fat of the peace offerings, because the bronze altar that was before Yahweh was too little to receive the burnt offering, the meal offering, and the fat of the peace offerings. Now you'll remember that when we talked about the building of the bronze altar, that thing was huge. That thing was big, and yet it didn't have enough space on it to handle the amount of offerings that people and Solomon himself were offering to God. And so you might be like, Jen, what the heck is going on here? Like, this seems like a lot of sacrifices, like maybe needless sacrifices. And generally I would agree with that because of what Leviticus talks about regarding sacrifices to God, specifically sacrifices of sheep, goats, or cattle of some sort. So let's read Leviticus 1:1-4. Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when any one of you offers an offering to Yahweh, you shall offer your offering of the livestock from the herd and from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without defect. He shall offer it at the door of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before Yahweh. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him." And it pretty much went like that across the board for most sacrifices, whether it was a burnt offering, a sin offering, a guilt offering, and then peace offerings were a little bit different. But generally, when somebody brought an offering to God, it would be one animal. They would have to lay their hands on that animal, and then the priest would slaughter that animal. And what was the point of somebody laying their hands on the head of that animal? It was because it was a solemn thing. You know, animals are cute and sweet and innocent, and no sane person likes the death of an innocent creature. So when that person had to bring that innocent animal to be sacrificed for their personal sin, they would essentially be transferring that sin to the animal. And that would be a moment for the person to reflect when they put their hands on that animal and have to kill something innocent in their place. It was supposed to be a solemn thing. And on top of that, it never says that somebody had to bring like 5 animals for their sin. They would just have to bring one particular animal. Unless they were bringing birds, then it would have to be 2. So the rules for birds were a little bit different. The person would not lay their hands on the birds. The priest would perform the entire ceremony. But the birds were generally for low-income individuals to still be able to gain forgiveness from God through the sacrifices. So birds were a little bit different. But when it came to cattle and any animal of the herd, like sheep and goats, the hands would have to be laid on that animal. And it just was one animal per person. But yet we read through the Old Testament, people bringing multiple animals to be sacrificed. I would say, just based upon Leviticus, that was something unnecessary. Large amounts of animals were not needed to gain forgiveness with God. It just took one sacrifice. Now, obviously, that sacrifice was imperfect because it was an animal, and then eventually you'd sin again. You'd have to bring another animal to atone for that sin, which is why eventually all animal sacrifices were done away with when Jesus came to earth and became the perfect sacrifice for all of us to atone for all of our sins all the time, essentially. So we don't do animal sacrifices now, but before Jesus came to earth, this was how people would gain forgiveness from God, was through the animal sacrifices. Because the wages of sin is death. Because we sin, death happens. If you sin, that means you have to die. Unless something innocent that has not sinned takes your place. And in the Old Testament, that innocent thing would have been an animal. But in the New Testament, that innocent sacrifice was the Lamb of God, or Jesus. So going back to 2 Chronicles 5, Solomon offering all of these sacrifices, about 140,000 for himself personally, like all these peace offerings, was very likely unnecessary. Here's what Hosea 6:6 says, and actually Jesus himself quotes this verse on a couple occasions. It says, "I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." That's from the ESV version. And then again, Psalm 40, verse 6, which, by the way, Psalm 40, my favorite chapter of the Bible, and also why P40 Ministries is named P40, is for Psalm 40. Psalm 40, verse 6 says, "In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required." So David got it. He understood that it wasn't sacrifice that God actually desired, but a heart that actually loves him. That is what God truly does desire. So in the case of Solomon offering all of these sacrifices to God, if he was doing it for himself, thinking that that would give him a better relationship with God, it was fully unnecessary and just needless animal death, we'll say. However, if Solomon were offering these peace offerings for the benefit of the people, then that's a different story. And it could be that that was exactly what he was doing, actually. In that case, it would have been fine to do. The peace offerings were a special type of offering where you would give only part of the animal to God. And then another part of the animal, I believe, would go to the priest, and the rest would go home to you and your family. And it was a way to have peace with God and fellowship with God. Now we find out in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 that Solomon held a huge feast for the people. It was a week-long feast where hundreds of thousands of people participated in this celebration, in this feast. So if Solomon were doing these peace offerings to dedicate them to the people, then that means that part of the meat of those sacrifices would have gone to the people. And it could be that's the way Solomon fed the people, was by doing this big peace offering and then giving the people the rest of the meat, thus providing all the meat for this huge celebration that took place. And when it comes to the people themselves, we don't know if they were offering multiple sacrifices, It could be that their hearts were in the right place and they really wanted to offer like a sin offering to God because they knew they had sinned. And so they brought their animal and they sacrificed it in the proper way. There could have been so many people participating in this sacrifice that that's the reason that so many animals ended up being sacrificed, was because each individual person was bringing their sacrifice to God correctly. And it turns out the priests couldn't even keep up with how many people wanted to bring sacrifices to God. So they had to build new altars, like quick little altars, so there'd be enough space to offer all of these sacrifices. But regardless, this big sacrifice takes place where every single person in Israel, it sounds like, is there offering their sacrifices. And it says in verse 7 of 2 Chronicles 5, our passage for today, the priests brought in the ark of Yahweh's covenant to its place into the inner sanctuary of the house to the most holy place, even under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim covered the ark and its poles above. The poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the ark in the front of the inner sanctuary, but they were not seen outside, and it is there to this day. And at that, you might be like, wait a second, Jen. If Ezra wrote the book of 2 Chronicles after the Babylonian captivity, when the temple was destroyed and the Ark of the Covenant had been gone for about 100 years at this point, how then could the Ark of the Covenant be there to this day? Well, the answer is found in 1 Kings chapter 8, 4 through 8. So let's go over there and read these verses. They brought up Yahweh's ark, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought these up. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled to him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and cattle that could not be counted or numbered for multitude. The priests brought in the ark of Yahweh's covenant to its place into the inner sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place, even under the cherubim's wings. For the cherubim spread their wings out over the place of the ark, and the cherubim covered the ark and its poles above. The poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they were not seen outside. They are there to this day. You're probably getting deja vu because that is literally word for word to what 2 Chronicles 5 says, which means that the author of Chronicles was quoting 1 Kings chapter 8. It is obvious that he was, because you can't get that many words and that many sentences perfectly aligned if you are not directly quoting somebody. So basically, that's just a direct quotation from 1 Kings chapter 8, not Ezra himself saying that the temple had not been destroyed in his lifetime and that the Ark of the Covenant was still there. That is not what Ezra is saying. He is just quoting 1 Kings chapter 8. And then moving on in our passage for today, verses 11 through 14 to conclude, it says, the priests had come out of the holy place, for the priests who were present had sanctified themselves and didn't keep their divisions, and also the Levites, who were the singers, Asaph, Heman, Jeduthun, and all their sons and their brothers, arrayed in fine linen, with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps. So all these guys, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, you might remember those names because David had dedicated those guys to being singers. So now they are no longer singers at the tent of meeting or at the place where the Ark of the Covenant was sitting, which was in Jerusalem under a tent. Now these three men and all of their sons and everybody else who were singers and instrumentalists with them came to the temple to work. This was their new job. They were going to be singers and worshipers at the temple. And they start singing. They were praising and thanking Yahweh, is what it says in verse 13. They lifted up their voice with the trumpets and the cymbals and the instruments and praised Yahweh, saying, for he is good, for his loving kindness endures forever. And at that, when the praise starts to happen, notice it's when the praise happens, not the sacrifices, like these multitudes of sacrifices that take place. It's when the praise starts, the worshiping begins. That is when God's presence fills the temple. God's presence came down in the form of a cloud, is what it says, so that the priests could not stand to minister by reason of the cloud, for Yahweh's glory filled God's house. That means that Yahweh has accepted the temple, but he didn't accept it until the praise and worship started to happen. And that shows how powerful praise and worship actually is. It's not about the things we do, the good works that we do for God. It's about our heart toward him. So if you feel like you're at an impasse, or you feel like God is like not listening to you, and you're like, God, I do all these things for you. You know, I go to church and I donate my money and I volunteer at this thing. And, you know, I do all these good things. Why aren't you listening to me? Why aren't you answering me? If you feel that way, maybe start worshiping God and praising him and thanking him the way these singers started to do. That was when God answered, was once the praise and the worship started. Which really goes to show that God truly does not desire sacrifice, but he desires our hearts and our love for him. Well, faithful listeners, I hope you learned something from today's episode. If you did, then tell people that the Bible Explained podcast exists, because word of mouth is one of the best ways for this podcast to grow. So I'm always appreciative of you faithful listeners who tell me that you are sharing the podcast with your loved ones. But if you're curious about other things that P40 Ministries does, then definitely take a look at the links listed in the description of this episode. You'll find the books that I have written, along with some merch that you can get. And I highly recommend, because fall is here and winter is around the corner, that you get one of the P40 Ministries beanies, because they're actually really, really nice. And I'm not lying about that. All of the merch that I have in my shop is really good quality, actually. I made sure to get you guys good stuff. So you got to go to the merch shop and get one of those beanies for yourself, or a t-shirt for yourself as well. Faithful listeners, have a fantastic rest of your day. I will see all of you guys tomorrow for an episode from 2 Thessalonians. Until tomorrow, happy listening and God bless.